Hello guys, I'm here to show you the application of the Engle and Granger co-integration test using Stata. But before that, we need to make some explanation of the concept of co-integration. Two variables that are not stationary and their individual pairs may move together over time so that their long-run relationship is stable. If that is the case, the variables are said to have co-integration. For example, income and consumption may individually drift over time, but they tend to move together in the long run. If that's the case still, they are said to have integrated. Even though the variables are individually non-stationary, some linear combination of them can be stationary. That is the concept of co-integration. We do have many approaches for co-integration test, but here we are presenting the Engle and Granger approach. The Engle and Granger approach involves some steps. First, it begins by estimating the unit root properties of the individual series involved, and the test requires all of the variables to be integrated of order 1. Once confirmed that the variables are all integrated of order 1, the next step is to estimate the long-run model using the conventional ordinary least squares method between the variables involved, such as this one. And after estimating this long-run relationship, we need to save the residuals from this regression. As a third step, we must test for the stationarity of this predicted residual using the augmented decay Fuller test. But you must not take the standard augmented decay Fuller critical to examine the stationarity property of this predicted residual, because we are testing only the predicted residuals but not actually observed variables. Instead, we have the critical values specific to co-integration test provided by the Engle and Granger approach that are readily available in any software. So, if the residuals are confirmed to be stationary, then we can conclude that the variables x and y are co-integrated. Otherwise, not. As a fifth step, only if there is significant evidence of co-integration between the variables, we are expected to estimate this error correction model to capture the short-term behavior or the short-term dynamics of the system and the speed of adjustment toward the long-run equilibrium. So in this error correction model, this gamma shows the speed of adjustment toward the long-run equilibrium, and the deltas show the short-run coefficients, and P indicates optimal lag size that are determined using the appropriate lag determination criterion. Let's start the formal test procedure using the data and the Stata memory, and that are available on the data editor. And we have here three variables: natural logarithm of gross domestic product, natural logarithm of consumer price index, and natural logarithm of exchange rate, each running from 1970 to 2023. And for the sake of simplicity, we are considering only two of them. That is the first two, ln of GDP and ln of consumer price index. And as we have discussed so far, the Engle and Granger co-integration test starts or begins with examining the unit root properties of the individual series. And in our last video on stationarity testing, we have confirmed that both of these variables, that is ln of GDP and ln of consumer price index, are both integrated of order 1. So that is most criteria to start or to apply the Engle and Granger co-integration test. So I recommend you to go back to our last video and check the properties or the stationarity property of this series, and we are not going to rerun that here. Recommending you to go back to our last video to check for the stationarity properties of the two series, that is ln of GDP and ln of consumer price index. I'm here directly estimating the long-run relationship between land GDP and land CPI. Let's go. To estimate that long-run relationship between natural logarithm of gross domestic product and natural logarithm of consumer price index, that is inflation, just type regress, or in short, reg, and click on the dependent variable, line of GDP in our case, and then line of consumer price index. Then enter. This is the long-run relationship between the dependent variable, that is economic growth, that because line GDP is a proxy for economic growth, and line of consumer price index a proxy for inflation. So dependent one is line GDP and independent is the line of consumer price index. And the estimated coefficient for consumer price index is this one. That means there is a positive relationship between line of GDP and line of consumer price index. That means there is positive relationship between inflation and economic growth, and the impact of inflation on economic growth is strongly significant because the calculated probability here is 0.000, and the calculated T statistics is 11.43. That is too much to conclude that the estimated coefficient is statistically significant. So this calculated probability value is much lower than the conventional 5%, and the calculated T value is much higher. Then that is the evidence of significant relationship between the two variables. We need to extract residuals from this regression just using this command. Follow me. Now type this command on the command window, that is predict, give any name. In my case, I'm just assigning the name XYZ to the residuals. Predict XYZ residuals of this model. Now residuals are predicted, and you will see here under the variables window, you will see a new variable, that is XYZ, that is extracted from the long-run model. And also you'll see the same variable just by browsing the data editor. Here you have it. Yeah, you know, XYZ is here. That is this XYZ, that is residuals extracted from the long-run model. So just after extracting these residuals, we are expected to test for the stationarity of these predicted residuals using the augmented decay Fuller. So to do that, use this command dfuller, click on the residuals indicator, that is XYZ, then use I'm using any arbitrary lag, that's one. Okay, as you can see here, this is the computed T statistics from the augmented decay Fuller regression. That's minus 1.647, which is much lower than the critical values at any of the three significance levels. Therefore, conclude that the predicted residuals from the long-run relationship between the variables x and y are not stationary at level, and therefore that means there is no co-integration, or there is no long-run relationship between the variables x and y. But as we have said in our last discussion, do not use the traditional critical values that are reported by the augmented and decay Fuller, because here we are testing the predicted residuals but not the actual variables. Therefore, we need to use instead the critical values that are appropriate for the co-integration test that are reported by the Engle and Granger approach. Therefore, you need to use directly this command, that is Engle Granger click on the dependent variable, that is natural logarithm of gross domestic product, and then on the independent one, that is the proxy for inflation, that is line of consumer price index. This command interestingly automates the Engle Granger integration test. First, it runs the Lagrange regression using oil loss implicitly by default, Second, it automatically extracts the residuals from that estimation. As a source, it applies the augmented Dickey Fuller test on the residuals, all implicitly. And finally, in the fourth, it reports the correct co-integration critical values. Here, interestingly, you will see the reported t-statistics is -1.331, and the critical values at the 1% level is -4.111, at the 5% critical value is -3.454, and at the 10% critical value is -3.125. Therefore, the calculated one is not more negative than any of these critical values, and therefore the residuals generated from our long-run model are not stationary at level. Therefore, there is no evidence of co-integration between the variables x and y. Thank you.